So, the final state banquet seating plan did not just move Queen Camilla, it erased her from the king's immediate side. An aide quietly opened the master rehearsal folder, removed Camilla's place card from the center, and slid it beneath a stack of ordinary protocol papers without a single spoken word. You do not accidentally alter the seating arrangement of a reigning monarch just hours before foreign dignitaries arrive at Buckingham Palace. When a royal seating plan shifts at the final hour, it is never a matter of simple logistics or innocent miscalculation. That is not a practical adjustment for a diplomatic dinner. That is a deliberate, coordinated demotion executed at the highest level of the royal household. The absolute silence of the room proved the wrongness of the moment. No senior courtier gasped, no one reached out to correct the aide, and the heavy, gold-embossed card bearing the queen consort's name vanished quietly into the shadows of a leather portfolio. It was executed with the chilling, practiced efficiency of a command that bypassed all debate. The state banquet is the ultimate theater of the British monarchy, a stage where every single millimeter of space is measured, mapped, and mathematically calculated to project absolute stability. The long mahogany table is not just a place to eat, it is a visible hierarchy, a physical manifestation of trust, power, and royal favor. To sit directly beside the king is to hold the ultimate shield of institutional approval. For years, Camilla has occupied that space, absorbing the camera flashes, the diplomatic smiles, and the immense pressure of standing as the sovereign's chosen equal. She had weathered decades of brutal public scrutiny to finally secure that chair. It was her armor. It was her undeniable proof that she belonged at the absolute center of the royal family. When the velvet chair is moved, that armor cracks. The staff standing in the grand dining room understood the seismic nature of what they were doing. Palace courtiers are trained to be completely invisible, to breathe without making a sound, and to carry out history-altering instructions as if they were merely polishing silver. Yet, as the new seating arrangement was laid out, a heavy, suffocating tension filled the air. The space beside King Charles was now designated for someone else. Princess Anne's name rested exactly where Camilla's should have been. To replace a wife with a sister at the most highly scrutinized social event of the royal calendar sends a message that vibrates through every single corridor of the palace. It tells the household staff, the visiting politicians, and the watching world that the internal foundation of the monarchy has suddenly shifted. The king was sending a silent signal that he required a different kind of armor for the battles ahead. He required a blood royal, someone born into the unforgiving machinery of the crown, someone whose loyalty to the institution is absolute and entirely separate from marital affection. Camilla was not entirely banished from the table, but in the language of the monarchy, distance is a punishment far worse than absence. To be moved down the line is to be publicly downgraded. It is a slow, agonizing realization that the proximity you fought your entire life to secure can be revoked with the stroke of a fountain pen. The aides smoothing the white linen tablecloths knew that this single alteration would ignite a firestorm behind closed doors. They knew that when the queen consort discovered her reassignment, the internal hurt would be profound, and the resulting silence between the king and his wife would be deafening. The palace machinery moves with a ruthless grace, always prioritizing the survival and the gleaming surface of the crown above the fragile feelings of the people who wear it. There are no apologies in these grand rooms, only instructions. The staff finished adjusting the crystal glasses and aligned the silver cutlery with absolute precision, leaving the new reality set in stone. Princess Anne would flank the king, presenting a united, unbreakable, and fiercely stoic front to the world. Camilla would sit further away, forced to maintain her composure while enduring the most humiliating demotion of her reign. This was not the sudden shifting of a ceremonial chair. This was the institution ruthlessly stripping away personal proximity to protect the crown. Before we go any further, make sure to subscribe to Crown Chronicles so you do not miss what comes next. There is a lot more to this story and it is still unfolding. The whole thing actually starts with one brief, heavily veiled exchange over a formal receiving line at a private diplomatic reception exactly 3 nights prior, and almost nobody paid attention at the time. The reception was supposed to be a minor, unrecorded event on the royal calendar, the kind of hushed gathering where guests sip champagne while aides silently monitor the clock from the shadows. Princess Anne had been quietly confirming her place in the upcoming greeting sequence with a visiting ambassador, executing the exact sort of flawless, invisible duty she has perfected over decades of service. Then, the queen consort stepped in. Without waiting for a natural pause in the conversation, Camilla openly interrupted and, sharply correcting the schedule to assert that she alone would be flanking the king for the arrival. It was a fleeting, icy moment, lasting no more than 10 seconds. To an untrained eye, it looked like a simple scheduling clarification. But inside the fiercely guarded walls of the royal household, interrupting a blood princess to assert marital dominance in front of foreign dignitaries is never a mistake. It is an earthquake. The public announcements leading up to the state banquet said the final arrangements were merely a reflection of standard ceremonial needs and long-established diplomatic custom, which made everyone assume this was just another routine, glittering evening at Buckingham Palace. The press was briefed to expect a unified family front, a flawless execution of traditional royal hospitality where every smile is carefully measured. But according to what is now coming out, during that exact same 72-hour timeframe, a vastly different private reality was already in motion. The moment Camilla interrupted and at the reception, the friction was documented. A private, highly classified note was drafted by a senior equerry, summarizing the incident in 5 devastating words: a visible confusion of authority. This note bypassed the usual administrative channels and was placed directly into the king's red box, the secure leather briefcase that carries the monarch's most urgent state papers. While the world was being told that the banquet preparations were entirely standard, the palace machinery was secretly executing a brutal reassessment of who could safely flank the sovereign without turning a global stage into a personal battlefield. The widening gap between the calm public facade and the ruthless private recalculation gave the most senior members of the royal household the exact leverage they needed to intervene. Someone inside the highest ranks of the protocol office, operating with the king's direct but silent approval, made the decision to bury that red box note and let the public believe the subsequent seating shift was nothing more than an ancient tradition being naturally rotated. Charles and his most trusted advisors chose to entirely suppress the reality of the diplomatic reception clash, deliberately hiding the fact that the queen consort was actively competing for visual supremacy. They smiled for the cameras, approved the generic, comforting press releases, and allowed Camilla to continue her elaborate dress fittings under the illusion that her central position was perfectly secure. The decision to hide the true motive behind the seating change was not made out of kindness, nor was it meant to protect the king's marriage. It was made out of a desperate need to maintain the pristine illusion of absolute, unbroken control over the family dynamic. This deliberately buried confrontation is the actual fire underneath everything that followed, transforming a simple dinner into a brutal test of royal discipline. Because if you are the king, and you have just realized your spouse's need for personal recognition is creating visible friction in front of international guests, you are no longer thinking about her hurt feelings, her public pride, or the peace of your own household. You are thinking about institutional survival. You realize that the crown cannot afford a queen consort who requires constant validation, and you immediately reach for the one person whose absolute restraint guarantees the monarchy will look utterly unshakable. The confrontation was never meant to be public, but inside a palace built on secrets, true privacy is an illusion. It began with a physical accident. A junior dresser, walking silently down the long corridor toward the royal apartments, accidentally noticed a heavy oak door left slightly ajar. Through the narrow gap, the amended seating chart lay exposed on a silver platter normally used for morning correspondence. The sharp daylight caught the glaring omission just seconds before a senior aide noticed the open door and hastily snapped it shut, but the visual damage was already done. Camilla did not learn of her demotion directly from her husband. She found out through a mid-level equerry who entered her private dressing room holding the revised schedule. He delivered the news in that careful, cold tone people use when they know their words are about to detonate. He simply stated that her procession entry and table position had been updated to reflect new ceremonial guidelines. Before uttering a single syllable in response, Camilla froze. Her hands, resting gently on the velvet fabric of her evening gown, tightened until her knuckles turned completely white. The blood drained from her face as she instantly recognized the bureaucratic language of exile. The queen consort did not wait for further explanation. She walked straight into the king's private study, bypassing the private secretaries who stood paralyzed by her sudden, unannounced intrusion. Charles was standing by the tall windows, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, fully anticipating the storm. Camilla's accusation came out raw, wounded, and fiercely personal. She demanded to know why she was being pushed to the edges of the very table she had bled to reach. She spoke of the decades of brutal public humiliation she had endured for him, the relentless media attacks she had survived, and the unwavering loyalty she had proven when the rest of the world turned against them. She reminded him that she had earned the absolute right to sit at his right hand, arguing that she had paid a far higher price than anyone else in the family to stand exactly where she was. She framed the seating change not as a matter of diplomatic protocol, but as a devastating betrayal of what she believed they had built together. Charles did not match her emotion. He turned around, his face a mask of absolute institutional exhaustion. He did not speak as a husband defending a miscommunication, he spoke as a monarch defending the crown. He stripped away the personal element completely. He told her that a state banquet was not a reward for past suffering, nor was it a celebration of their marriage. It was a projection of the monarchy's unshakable discipline. He stated, in a voice entirely devoid of warmth, that the crown could not afford the optics of internal competition when the world was watching. Then, he delivered the single sentence that reframed their entire history. The space beside the monarch was never reserved for a wife, it demands unquestioned steadiness. He did not call after her when she stepped back in shock. He offered no apologies, no soft reassurances, and no promises of making it up to her at the next engagement. His silence became his final, brutal answer. Charles stayed exactly where he was, refusing to close the physical distance between them. He turned his gaze away from her flushed, devastated face and slowly reached for his gold fountain pen on the mahogany desk. He picked it up, letting it tap once against the polished wood, a sharp, cold sound that echoed loudly in the quiet room, staring blankly at the portrait of his ancestors on the far wall. The king chose the institution over the woman standing right in front of him, and his physical refusal to speak further made it agonizingly clear that the conversation was permanently over. Camilla left the study carrying a wound far older than the seating chart. This confrontation did not create her deepest insecurity, it violently reopened a decades-old nightmare. For years, she had been the ultimate outsider, the hidden figure forced to wait in the shadows while the machinery of the palace elevated someone else. Now, even with a crown on her head, she realized a terrifying truth: she could still be erased whenever the monarchy deemed her inconvenient. The legitimacy she thought she had permanently secured was suddenly fragile, conditional, and subject to the ruthless whims of royal optics. Charles carried his own heavy burden out of that room. He knew exactly what it cost him to make this choice. He had sacrificed the peace of his marriage and inflicted immense pain on the woman he fought so hard to marry, all to protect the pristine image of the crown. The isolation of his position had never felt colder. He had secured the banquet's flawless execution, but he had deeply fractured his home. And this is exactly why the days following this collision are so incredibly dangerous. Camilla is a woman who has spent her entire life mastering the art of the long game. She knows how to survive, and she knows how to quietly rebuild her influence. Now that she understands she can be pushed aside, the uncertainty of what she might quietly orchestrate behind the scenes casts a long, dark shadow over the entire household. To understand what Queen Camilla is actually losing, and what Princess Anne is seamlessly assuming, you need to understand what this exact position, the right hand of the sovereign, has already survived. This is not simply a matter of dining etiquette or modern public relations. It is an inheritance of power. The space directly beside the monarch is the most heavily contested real estate in the history of the British Empire. It is a position that has been fought over, bled for, and violently defended for centuries. When a royal seating arrangement shifts, it is never just background noise. It is a direct escalation of an ancient, ruthless game of survival. Centuries ago, the physical proximity to the king was literally a matter of life and death, carrying a documented body count that stains the archives of the monarchy. If you look back to the court of King Henry VIII, the women who demanded to be recognized as his absolute equal, who required the constant visible validation of the crown to secure their own fragile standing, were not merely moved down a table when they became a liability. They were entirely erased from existence. Anne Boleyn fought a vicious, unprecedented battle to displace a beloved royal and sit at the king's right hand, restructuring the entire religious foundation of a country just to legitimize her proximity. But the moment her presence threatened the unshakable authority of the monarch, the institution turned on her with terrifying speed. She was not just demoted, she was imprisoned in the Tower of London and beheaded. Similarly, Catherine Howard, who relied solely on affection rather than institutional duty to secure her place beside the throne, met the exact same brutal fate the moment her personal actions introduced chaos into the king's domain. Their fates serve as the ultimate, violent proof of the crown's darkest mechanism. The institution will happily elevate a spouse when it serves the narrative, but it will absolutely destroy them the second they become an inconvenience to the sovereign's power. You do not even have to look back that far to find the exact historical parallel staring this current family directly in the face. Less than 90 years ago, a remarkably similar crisis threatened to tear the monarchy apart. King Edward VIII believed that his personal affection for Wallis Simpson was powerful enough to rewrite the ironclad rules of royal precedence. He thought he could elevate a woman the institution deemed unsuitable, insisting she stand right beside him at the very center of royal life. He demanded that his personal love story supersede the cold, unyielding duty of the crown. The establishment's response was devastatingly swift and utterly uncompromising. They did not just deny her a seat, they forced the king himself to abdicate the throne. Wallis Simpson was permanently exiled from the inner circle, living out her days an ocean away from the power she tried to claim. The pattern is incredibly clear, and it is not new. The institution has an ancient, terrifying immune system designed to reject anyone who attempts to bend the monarchy to their own personal emotional needs. The crown demands absolute, unquestioning submission, and it has destroyed far stronger figures than Camilla to maintain that order. Only the names have changed, the brutal mathematics of royal survival remain exactly the same. Even the very concept of the queen consort's unchallenged authority has been completely destroyed and resurrected from nothing. During the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, the idea of a spouse sharing the monarch's spotlight was entirely obliterated. Elizabeth refused to marry, recognizing that any partner standing beside her would inevitably dilute her absolute power and invite factional warfare into her court. She ruled entirely alone, turning her solitary figure into a towering symbol of untouchable strength. The space beside the monarch remained completely empty for decades, proving that the crown does not actually need a partner to survive, it only needs discipline. This historical erasure shows that the position Camilla occupies is not a divine right. It is a temporary privilege that can be suspended, revoked, or entirely eliminated if it ceases to serve the monarch. The institution is unkillable, but the people who marry into it are entirely disposable. And after all of that, after surviving centuries of beheadings, forced abdications, institutional exiles, and the ruthless erasure of ambitious consorts, this exact physical space was decided by King Charles in the quietest, most vulnerable hour of his reign. Ask yourself if Queen Camilla fully understands what she is holding when she demands to sit at the center of the table. She is not fighting against Princess and for a better view of the ballroom. She is standing on a historical trapdoor that has swallowed Queens whole the moment they forgot that the crown will always choose its own survival over a spouse's pride. And this explosive confrontation over a chair did not come from nowhere. It had been quietly building for decades, hidden beneath polite smiles, forced pleasantries, and rigid palace protocol, waiting for the perfect moment to finally break the surface and demand a permanent resolution. Years ago, long before Charles wore the crown, Princess Anne asked for something incredibly small regarding a secondary family gathering. It was a minor adjustment in the walking order, a simple request to remain positioned near her brother during a moment of deep family significance. It seemed entirely trivial at the time, a detail that should have been settled with a brief nod. Yet, the denial was swift, and it did not come through a personal conversation. It was handed down through cold, institutional channels. A junior equerry informed the Princess Royal that her request had been firmly rejected to ensure the visual focus remained squarely on Charles and his new wife. Nobody apologized for the dismissal. Nobody bothered to explain why a lifelong working royal was being abruptly shuffled toward the back of the line. And did not shout. She did not summon reporters to express her outrage. She said absolutely nothing publicly, allowing the palace machinery to function exactly as it was designed. She silently accepted the indignity while maintaining her flawless public mask, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. More recently, the pattern became impossible to ignore, accompanied by significantly higher stakes. The exact privilege Anne had been coldly denied the right to keep her own circle close during a major ceremonial event was suddenly and effortlessly rolled out for Camilla's own family members. During a highly televised balcony appearance, the public watched as the queen consort's relatives were quietly guided into the primary camera angles, taking up the prime physical space usually reserved strictly for senior blood royals. And discovered this visual reshuffling the exact same way the general public did, through the unblinking lenses of the broadcast cameras, not through any form of respectful internal communication. She was left entirely out of the briefing, treated like an afterthought in her own family's home. Still, the Princess Royal said absolutely nothing publicly. She did not flinch, nor did she show a single ounce of frustration to the watching world. But her internal strategy shifted entirely. She stopped assuming the institution would protect her, and she quietly started keeping records. The clash at the diplomatic reception was the third time. Except this time, the scale, the stakes, and the international visibility were completely different. Camilla had grown deeply accustomed to the quiet capitulation of the blood royals. She assumed that openly correcting and in front of foreign dignitaries would simply be another swift victory in her long, calculated campaign to secure absolute authority. She firmly believed the Princess Royal would retreat into the background, just as she had done for years. But Camilla deeply miscalculated the environment. She failed to realize that every previous retreat was not a surrender, it was a highly tactical withdrawal, waiting for an arena where the king simply could not afford to indulge his wife's ambition over the safety of the crown. According to people who have worked closely with her for years, the Princess Royal kept a private, careful record of every single occasion where the institution bent to accommodate vanity over duty. She never complained to the press or sought sympathy. She merely documented the slights, the breached protocols, and the quiet usurpations of power. She built a silent archive of every single moment the crown was made to look weak or disorganized for the sake of personal comfort. The absolute vagueness of this collection makes it infinitely more terrifying. That kind of patient buried anger tends to be far more dangerous than anything loud. Because it never fades. It only builds, compounding with every ignored insult. And the person who finally acts on it has been thinking about exactly what to do for a very long time. Some of you are probably wondering whether King Charles can even do this. Can he actually remove a crowned queen consort from his side at a state banquet without triggering a constitutional crisis? Can he simply erase the seating hierarchy that protocol officers spent weeks designing, and do it this fast, without asking anyone for permission? The answer is absolutely yes. Legally, structurally, and historically, he can do whatever he wants regarding ceremonial placement. Here is exactly why this move was completely bulletproof from the very moment his fountain pen touched the paper. The mechanism he used is known as the sovereign's royal prerogative over precedence and ceremonial order. In plain language, this means the king holds the absolute, unchallengeable authority to dictate exactly who stands where, who walks first, and who sits closest to the throne during any official state occasion. The protocol office only advises, the monarch ultimately decides. Camilla's position beside him was never protected by law, parliamentary statute, or constitution. It was always a courtesy, a temporary privilege granted entirely at the king's personal discretion. Legally, Charles is allowed to do exactly what he did. No permission slip required. No parliamentary vote taken. Nothing. He does not need a consensus from his senior advisors, and he certainly does not need the approval of his spouse. When the king decides that the visual stability of the crown requires Princess Anne at his right hand instead of his wife, his decision instantly becomes the undisputed law of the palace. The sheer absolute nature of this power is what makes the sudden shift so devastatingly final. There is no appeal process for the queen consort once the sovereign has spoken. But what made this so unusual wasn't whether the king had the right to make the change. It was the terrifying speed, the ruthless timing, and the total silence that accompanied it. When you look at the mechanics of royal event planning, decisions like this normally take months to negotiate. Courtiers draft endless memos, risk assessments are heavily debated in hushed rooms, and gradual transitions are carefully mapped out to protect everyone's public dignity. This happened in mere hours. It happened with a single signature behind closed doors, entirely skipping every traditional phase of internal diplomatic negotiation. It was an execution of power so impossibly swift that the people affected by it did not even have the time to formulate a proper response before the physical chairs were already being moved. Usually, a shift of this magnitude comes with a carefully orchestrated media strategy. When previous similar actions adjusting working royal roles happened, the palace issued elegant statements, briefed favored journalists, and held quiet off-the-record press conferences to carefully manage the narrative and soothe bruised egos. This time, there was absolutely nothing. There was no explanation, no gentle briefing to soften the blow. Just a quiet update to the master briefing folder, buried deep where nobody would think to look until it was far too late to stop it. And that silence screams louder than any press release ever could. By refusing to announce the change, the institution sent a terrifying message. This was not a matter up for public discussion, and Camilla's feelings on the matter were entirely irrelevant. If you look closely at the timeline, the true urgency becomes undeniable. Stack the moves together. The reception incident happened, the private warning note was immediately placed in the red box, the dressing room notification was coldly delivered, and the finalized procession order was locked into place. Individually, each of these steps could look like routine palace succession planning or minor logistical adjustments. Together, they reveal a massive, coordinated pattern of desperate institutional urgency. Royal historians who have studied past reigns say they cannot find another example of this many major powers shifting this fast without an official announcement ever confirming why. The consequences of that single altered chair did not end when the banquet hall doors finally closed. They are already reshaping the daily geography of the palace. What changed this week inside the household is entirely physical and impossible to ignore. There is an empty space where Queen Camilla's staff would normally coordinate their morning schedules with the king's equerries. A heavy mahogany door that usually remains propped open between their respective protocol offices has stayed firmly shut for several consecutive days. Staff members describe the queen consort as unusually withdrawn, noting that she has quietly skipped several minor engagements she would normally never miss, allowing her communications team to cite vague scheduling conflicts that no one inside the building truly believes. Silence inside a family built entirely on carefully managed public appearances is rarely ever just silence. It is almost always a decision being made behind closed doors. The emptiness in those corridors is not an accident, it is the physical manifestation of a newly enforced boundary, and the entire staff is watching it happen. But the visible absence is only the beginning. What is truly dangerous is what is being quietly prepared out of sight. According to people familiar with private discussions happening inside the palace, a much larger structural shift is currently being mapped out away from the cameras. Protocol teams are not just reviewing the aftermath of the banquet, they are quietly drafting entirely new precedence guidelines for all upcoming diplomatic visits and state occasions. This feels exactly like leaked intelligence because it touches the very core of how the monarchy operates. They are reportedly looking into the formal legal mechanisms of royal succession planning to permanently adjust the visual hierarchy of the working family. This means the king's senior aides are actively designing a framework that would systematically place blood royals permanently closer to the center of power while gradually shifting spouses outward. They are laying the ironclad institutional groundwork to ensure that the sudden demotion Camilla experienced becomes the permanent, unquestioned template for the future. Then there is the ultimate consequence, the unspoken reality hovering over every single private meeting. At least one senior legal figure inside the household has reportedly raised a possibility dark enough to shake anyone who thinks this story is finished. The nuclear option is not divorce or formal banishment, it is the systematic reduction of Camilla's role to purely social and charitable functions, entirely stripping away any perceived constitutional or co-monarch authority she has fought so desperately to cultivate. They would legally and visually sever her from the serious duties of the crown, reducing her presence to mere decoration. Nothing this binding, this total, and this unprecedented has ever been attempted this far in advance of a sovereign transition. Which means everything the Princess Royal has just survived and everything the Queen Consort has just lost might not be the end of this war at all. It might only be the opening shot. All of these shadow maneuvers are racing toward a terrifyingly public deadline that will force this entire conflict into the glaring open. The upcoming annual remembrance ceremony is the one calendar event where placement is absolute, highly visible, and heavily scrutinized by the entire nation. There is no glittering jewelry or grand banquet table to distract the eye, there is only stark black clothing, cold daylight, and the brutal reality of who stands exactly where on those balconies. Palace staff have quietly started using language normally reserved for occasions of historic finality when discussing the balcony standing orders for that Sunday. There are extra, highly secretive preparations regarding the exact spacing and camera angles that nobody has explained and nobody has denied. Ask yourself why that level of obsessive, protective preparation would be necessary for an ordinary historical event that they execute the exact same way every single year. And you already know why so many people close to this family believe they know exactly what is coming. She did not speak. She did not approach. She merely stood there in the dimly lit edge of the grand corridor, watching the heavy, gilded doors swing open for the king and the princess royal. The queen consort watched them step forward together into the brilliant, blinding light of the state banquet hall, moving in perfect, unbroken synchronization. She was standing mere feet away from the absolute center of royal power, yet the emotional distance might as well have been an ocean. There was no physical barrier holding her back, no guards blocking her path, but she was completely trapped by the newly drawn architecture of the room. She could not claim the space directly beside her husband. She could not stop the international cameras from capturing Princess and seamlessly absorbing the immense public authority that was supposed to be hers. She could not reverse the brutal protocol choreography that had just permanently rewritten her place in the family hierarchy. Her absolute silence in that hallway was the terrifying, sinking realization that the power struggle was already over before the evening even officially began. She merely observed the ancient machinery of the monarchy working exactly as it was designed to, violently correcting itself and leaving her entirely on the periphery. The real question was never whether Queen Camilla had earned the right to sit at the king's right hand through decades of brutal public endurance, quiet loyalty, and carefully managed public relations. It was always whether the crown, in its most vulnerable and hyper-scrutinized hour, could afford to let her keep that seat without appearing fatally divided to the rest of the world. And whether the sacred space directly beside the sovereign will even still exist for her by the time the next great ceremonial test demands a united front. History doesn't usually announce itself with a press release. It rarely arrives with loud, theatrical declarations or widely broadcast speeches from the throne room. It happens exactly here, in the quiet, devastating shifting of a velvet chair. It happens in the subtle adjustment of a walking sequence, in a name quietly and permanently erased from a leather protocol folder, and in the cold, unyielding silence of a king who refuses to look back at the wife he just left behind. The institution has made its ultimate choice, setting a new, ruthless precedent that alters the structural trajectory of everyone trapped inside its walls. And as the royal household now prepares for the inevitable, deeply unforgiving exposure of the upcoming balcony appearances, the true institutional cost of this silent, devastating reassignment is only just beginning to